January 17th, 1945. The Rhine River, Germany. The winter sky hung low and colorless over the shattered stone piers of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen. German engineers stood in the frozen mud, watching American convoys approach through the morning fog. They had destroyed every crossing for 300 kilometers, ancient stone arches that had stood for centuries, reduced to twisted iron and rubble in the dark water below. The Rhine was their fortress now, a natural moat 700 feet wide, its current swift enough to drag a man under in seconds. The Germans knew their history. They knew what rivers meant to armies. Napoleon had been stopped here. The Romans had built their empire's edge along these banks. And now as they watched the Americans gather on the western shore, they permitted themselves a moment of grim satisfaction. Let them try. Let them bring their pontoons and their engineers. The Rhine would swallow them whole, just as it had swallowed every army that dared to cross against prepared defenders. What the German observers did not know, what they could not have imagined, was that tucked inside those olive-drab trucks was a weapon that would render their carefully destroyed bridges irrelevant. Not a bomb, not a tank. A bridge that came in pieces, carried by hand, assembled by ordinary soldiers in hours instead of months. The Bailey Bridge, a puzzle of standardized steel panels, 10 feet long, 5 feet wide, weighing just 600 pounds each, designed by a mild-mannered British civil servant named Donald Bailey, a man who had never served in combat, never commanded troops, never fired a shot in anger, just an engineer who understood that modern war moved too fast for ancient methods. The German military had built its doctrine on engineers, the Pioniere, elite units trained for years in complex bridge construction. Their training manuals ran to hundreds of pages. Their equipment required specialized crews, heavy machinery, precise measurements. A temporary military bridge over a major river was a logistical triumph, a feat requiring days of preparation, tons of material shipped by rail, and the coordinated effort of battalion-strength units. This was engineering as they understood it, technical, methodical, time-consuming, the work of professionals. When German intelligence reported that American forces were deploying prefabricated bridges, their engineers scoffed. Prefabricated? For a combat crossing? Impossible. Such a structure would lack the load capacity for armor. It would be too weak, too temporary, too simple. War was not simple. But war had changed. The Americans had industrialized everything, even spontaneity. February 7th, 1945, near the Ruhr River. A German artillery observer dug into the eastern bank, watched through his binoculars as American engineers arrived at dawn. He expected to see them for days, surveying, measuring, building approaches. Instead, he saw something that made him lower his binoculars and look again with naked eyes, certain his optics were deceiving him. The Americans were assembling the bridge in sections on the bank, working like factory men on an assembly line. No surveying, no calculations scrawled in notebooks, just soldiers, not specialist engineers, ordinary infantrymen, trained in a few days, lifting panels, dropping pins into place, moving with the rhythm of men building something they had built a dozen times before. 3 hours after they began, tanks were crossing, Sherman tanks, 30 tons each, rolling across a bridge that had not existed at breakfast. The observer called in coordinates for artillery. By the time the first shells arrived, the Americans had already pushed 2 companies across. By nightfall, they had built 2 more bridges a kilometer downriver. The shells destroyed one. By morning, it was repaired. This was the nightmare the Germans had not prepared for, not the bridge itself, but what it represented. The Americans treated bridges like ammunition, expended, replaced, multiplied. When one fell, another rose. The Wehrmacht fought with the psychology of scarcity, hoarding resources, calculating every loss. The Americans fought with the psychology of abundance. They had calculated something different, that speed mattered more than permanence, that quantity was its own quality, that a bridge built in 3 hours and destroyed in 3 days had still won the war if it put a division across the river. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt received the reports with the weary recognition of a man watching his worldview collapse panel by panel. He had destroyed the bridges. He had fortified the rivers. He had done everything right according to doctrine that was already obsolete. In his dispatch to Berlin, he wrote with uncharacteristic bitterness about the American capacity to improvise the permanent. The phrase captured something profound. The Bailey Bridge was not impressive because it was strong, though it could carry a 70-ton tank. It was impressive because it rendered strength irrelevant. The Germans built fortresses. The Americans built factories. By March, as the Allies closed on the Rhine itself, German commanders stopped counting the Bailey bridges. There were too many. American engineers were throwing them across tributaries, canals, bomb craters, ravines, anywhere steel panels could span empty air. At Wessel, they built a bridge under artillery fire, working through the night, replacing casualties with the next squad in line. The bridge opened at dawn. At Mainz, they bridged the Rhine in 9 hours, at Worms in 7. The river that was supposed to stop armies for weeks was becoming an inconvenience measured in hours. There is a photograph from April 1945 that captured the truth the Germans had been too late to understand. It shows a Bailey Bridge crossing the Weser River, tanks streaming across in column. In the foreground, half submerged in the mud, are the remains of a German bridge. Intricate ironwork, massive stone footings, destroyed by Wehrmacht engineers themselves. Beautiful craftsmanship, centuries in design. And beside it, almost insulting in its simplicity, the prefabricated steel panels of the Bailey, functional and plain, and utterly victorious. The war was not won by better soldiers or braver men. It was won by nations that understood the industrial age had rewritten the rules, that complexity was now a weakness, that the side which could build, destroy, and rebuild faster would drown the enemy in options, in speed, in the simple, terrible mathematics of replaceable things. The Germans laughed at prefabrication. They stopped laughing somewhere between the Rhine and Berlin, as Bailey bridges multiplied behind the Allied advance like steel fungi after rain. Each one a reminder that the future belonged to those who could afford to be wasteful with miracles.